Hey everyone, welcome to week 17. And this is the final edition of the week 17 of the Fantasy Football Rankings Expert Predictions series where me, Bradley Stalder, I compare my rankings to the Fantasy Pros Accuracy Rankings contest and I identify players who are higher or lower than the consensus. And every year Fantasy Pros host a fantasy football accuracy contest, and there are over 200 of the industry's top writers and experts, where they all try to compete in a rankings contest. The most accurate rankings wins. Of course, the scoring is fierce, and it requires experts to perfectly predict the order of quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends, and where those players will rank by the end of the week. And of course, I want you to check out my fantasy data article, which will be dropping here shortly for the most up to date week 17 rankings, because maybe they change. Maybe there's a situation. Maybe we find out about weather or an injury that impacts a player's ranking. Nevertheless, I anticipate a lot of news will come out between now, when you're watching the video, and when Sunday, 1 p.m., when the rankings contest concludes. Best of luck as well for those who are in your fantasy championships. I hope this has been helpful for you this year. Now, last week, week 16, I finished 12th overall in the contest, third overall at tight end rankings, and seventh at IDP. Entering week 17, I am 45th overall in this contest, 32nd at wide receivers, 33rd at tight ends, and 7th at IDP in accuracy out of 211 rankers year to date. And this is a reminder as well that I also advise on Fantasy Data's weekly rankings. They're an excellent resource for anyone looking to win their league, along with player projections and advanced metrics. If you don't have a Fantasy Data subscription, make sure you're using the promo code FFF20. That will get you 20% off any size subscription. It could be a $5 subscription. It could be a $200 subscription. It does not matter the size. Use the promo code FFF20. And Fantasy Data is trusted in the industry. JJ Zacharyson uses it. Matthew Berry uses it. The fantasy footballers use it. I use it. It's a trusted source of fantasy data in the industry. So go to fantasydata.com, use the promo code FFF20 for a subscription, 20% off. Let's get into the rankings, though. A quarterback that I'm higher on this week is Brock Purdy. And fantasy managers have to hand it to this rookie quarterback. He's taken over for Jimmy Garoppolo and played admirably, both in real life and in fantasy. Purdy has finished with no fewer than 15 fantasy points in a contest and has 2 or more touchdowns in each of his 4 starts. And while he may not throw for 300 or more yards to access those elite quarterback ceilings, he doesn't rush for many fantasy points either. Purdy completely competently gets the ball to his pass catchers. And he has a green matchup now against the Las Vegas Raiders, who just benched longtime starter Derek Carr. And the Raiders allow the 5th most passing yards and 8th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. The Raiders also rank as the most favorable pass DVOA matchup and have the 2nd lowest sack rate among defenses in the NFL. Per PFF, the 49ers offensive line projects to have a 22% pass block advantage over the Las Vegas defensive line. Purdy should have plenty of time to throw and allow plays to develop down the field. It's already, a Kyle Shanahan offense, so you're going to get yards after the catch, but it's about allowing those plays downfield as well to develop, and that's what George Kittle and Brandon Ayuk are going to do against this Vegas Raiders defense. Purdy is my quarterback 11. He gets into that strong streaming quarterback contention. His consensus is 15. I feel like it's just too middling for me in this week in a very plus matchup with good weapons. Give me Brock Purdy as a top 12 quarterback this week. A lower ranked quarterback this week is Trevor Lawrence. Lawrence has crushed lately. He's finished as a top 5 quarterback in 3 of the last 5 weeks, and he has 7 top 8 weekly quarterback finishes on the season. But there are larger factors at play for the Jaguars in week 17. This game does not matter for the playoff futures. If the Jaguars win week 18 against the Titans, they make the playoffs. If they win week 17, lose week 17, it doesn't really matter. While Doug Peterson may not announce that he'll bench the starters for the Jaguars, there are many scenarios in which later in the game, fantasy managers can recognize that the likes of Lawrence or ETN or even Christian Kirk may get pulled to preserve them for a week 18 game and for a possibility at the playoffs. Peterson has a history of unorthodox benchings, and that includes the benching of Jalen Hurts a couple years ago in favor of Nate Sudfeld at the end of the 2020 season. And to make matters worse for Lawrence, the Houston Texans allow the second fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks, not because they're lockdown defense, but because opposing teams opt to run the ball, and they do so efficiently. The last time Lawrence played Houston, he only went 25 for 47 for 286 passing yards. He had 2 interceptions in the game, 0 touchdowns. He finishes the quarterback 21 on the week. There are many paths to failure for Trevor Lawrence, and that's why he ranks outside my top 10 of quarterbacks for the week. He's not a strong start as much as we like to think, oh, Trevor Lawrence has been this, up and coming quarterback, which he has been. But I think we've got to pause for this week and not get too excited. There are paths to failure for Lawrence, and we have to be a little wary about that. A running back I'm higher on this week is Chuba Hubbard, and he's quietly been a pretty good producer in the touches he's had this year. Since the Christian McCaffrey trade, Chuba Hubbard has rotated with Donta Foreman, and yes, Donta Foreman has had 5 games with over 100 rushing yards on the year, but Hubbard has 4 games with at least 63 rushing yards, and he's had many fewer carries. So, fantasy managers, you should remember back in week 7 against Tampa Bay, Chuba Hubbard was announced as the starter and proceeded to rush 9 times for 63 yards and catch 2 passes for 10 yards. He scored a touchdown. He outsnapped and out-carried and out-touched Donta Foreman before Hubbard got injured in that game. And Hubbard worked his way back from an injury and has had 12 or more carries and 65 or more rushing yards in 3 of the last 4 games, including a season-high 125 rushing yards against a very stout Detroit Lions defense. Remember, the Lions going into that Week 16 game had only allowed 55.5 rushing yards per game to opposing running backs. So since week 14, Hubbard is 3rd in rush yards per attempt at 7 yards per carry, 5th among running backs in breakaway run rate at a 46.9% rate, and 10th among running backs with 3.4 yards after contact per attempt. But it's not just the rushing, it's also the receiving, as Hubbard has sprinkled in 3 targets in 4 of the last 7 games. Hubbard should be in your top 30 of running backs, and he's a flex consideration going into your championship weeks. A running back I'm lower on this week is Josh Jacobs. And it's likely that Josh Jacobs' magical season in 2022 will end up sputtering here near the end. Jacobs finished as the running back 20 and running back 39 each of the last 2 weeks. And that's despite 39 carries and 3 receptions during that span. But there are two major factors that are going to impact Jacobs in week 17. Number 1, Jarrett Stidham. And number 2, the San Francisco 49ers defense. We'll start with the 49ers defense. They give up the fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs on the season, only 13.2 points per game. They allowed the fewest rushing yards, 59, and have not allowed a running back touchdown on the season. In 8 games where Jacobs does not score a touchdown, he finishes on average as the running back 26, with 3 of those games outside the top 30 of running back. It's a scary floor for Jacobs, and what's even scarier is that his quarterback, Jarrett Stidham, only has 4 games with 10 or more pass attempts. And in half of those games, in 2 of the 4 games that Jarrett Stidham has at least 10 pass attempts, he has below a 40% completion percentage in those games. The Raiders only project to score 16.2 points in this matchup, and that's limiting the upside of Jacobs. Josh Jacobs won't likely make my top 18 of running backs in week 17. His consensus is as a back-end running back 1, and I just can't get behind that. He's a back-end running back 2 for me because he could fall in the end zone, and he does get volume, but there's not a lot of upside in this matchup against the 49ers, and it could be a real negative bust game, especially if you've been banking on Jacobs going into this week. DJ Chark has been absolutely on fire as of late. He's finished 3 of his last 4 games with 94 or more receiving yards, and 4 of Chark's 9 games he's finished as a top 23 wide receiver, and nearly all of them against plus secondaries. The Chicago Bears are the 4th best pass DVOA matchup and have allowed 25 or more points to opposing teams since week 8, and they on average give up 32 team points per game since week 8. So while DJ Chark wasn't active for that last Bears matchup, Khalif Raymond and Tom Kennedy, who played on the outside for the Lions in that game, they combined 4 for 91 on 5 targets. Pretty much a DJ Chark line. Uh, and the only bust game for Chark since his injury was when he was shadowed by Sauce Gardner. There's no Sauce Gardner on the Chicago Bears. And in fact, the Bears project to only start one defensive back in Sunday's matchup who has any NFL rookie draft capital at all. Chark is my wide receiver 26 for this week. He falls just outside wide receiver 24, so like outside that wide receiver 2 range, but that's where we want to move him up to, is a high-end wide receiver 3 instead of a low-end wide receiver 3. There's a lot more upside here than is put into Chark's ranking, and we need to be comfortable in bumping him up. Look, this is where the mighty have fallen. Mike Evans is on my lower ranked wide receiver list this week. The only highlight for Mike Evans this year is that he's within striking distance of achieving his 9th straight 1,000 receiving yard season. Evans has finished no better than the wide receiver 32 over the last 7 games, on average finishing as the wide receiver 48 during that span. Evans hasn't scored a touchdown since week 4 against Kansas City, and that's despite earning 8 or more targets in 8 of his last 10 games. Brady has really struggled to throw the ball down the field, especially to Mike Evans, and we've seen that in Mike Evans' catch rate. Evans' 57.8% catch rate this season. He was at 65 and 64% catch rates each of the last 2 seasons when Brady was quarterbacking. And look, Evans hasn't helped the cause because he's 6th among wide receivers with 7 drops. So I don't know how we can put in Mike Evans as a mid to back end wide receiver 2 when he hasn't even been really a back end wide receiver 3 at all over the last 2 months. So drop him down, wide receiver 32 for me. He's consensus wide receiver 21. I don't understand the optimism. Last time it took 15 targets for Mike Evans to get a top 20 wide receiver weekly finish against the Carolina Panthers. The reality is that Mike Evans is not in line for a good game. And CJ Henderson he's been torched in a few games, but he's also played really tight in a few others. And, I'm trusting that Mike Evans will continue this trend of poor play. There's not really a lot of reasons for optimism. We're bumping Mike Evans down, back end wide receiver 3 for this week. One of the higher ranked tight ends, and maybe I'm not even high enough, is Logan Thomas. Thomas has been drawing dead for most of the fantasy season. He's tight end 33 in fantasy points per game, tight end 35 in yards per route run, and only averages a 12.9% target share on the season. That's 22nd best among tight ends. But why is he on this list? Why is there sudden optimism for Logan Thomas during this championship week? He's a tight end 2 streaming option for me. And here's the reason. Logan Thomas has 5 or more targets in 4 of the 5 games he's played with Carson Wentz this year. And when Wentz took over for Taylor Heineke mid-game against San Francisco, he proceeded to target Thomas 6 times on 16 pass attempts. That's a 37.5% target share. In 7 Taylor Heineke games, Logan Thomas earned 5 targets just once. So if you're desperate at tight end, Logan Thomas offers a glimmer of hope now that Carson Wentz has been announced as the starter against the Cleveland Browns. Thomas is my tight end 17. He's consensus tight end 25. Bump him up. He is not outside the top 24. In fact, if he gets into the end zone, Logan Thomas, top 12 tight end. But I think, there's the hedge that he may or may not. But tight end 17, you have to like the target share, bump him up, have a little bit more confidence in Logan Thomas. And Carson Wentz, not only has he targeted Logan Thomas a lot this year, but we know historically Carson Wentz loves to target his tight ends. You can think back in Philadelphia with Dallas Goedert and Zach Ertz coexisting in that offense for Philadelphia, but also last year with Jack Doyle, Mo Alley Cox, getting some significant play at tight end. So Logan Thomas, tight end 17, I think is the right spot for him this week. And the lower ranked tight end for me this week is Mark Andrews yet again. Last week I moved Mark Andrews down from tight end 2 to tight end 9, and that was the right call, and it wasn't even far enough. The consensus really can't let go of Mark Andrews, can they? I feel like a broken record because, as I mentioned, I was low on Andrews last week, but I haven't been wrong. Andrews has finished no better than the tight end 19 over the last 3 weeks and has finished on average as the tight end 21 since week 7. Andrews still hasn't scored since week 6, and with Tyler Huntley expected to start yet again with Lamar Jackson missing his 11th straight practice, the optimism of Andrews' upside has just not matched that production. And Andrews had one of the best matchups in week 16. There were people on Twitter saying, oh, we got to start Mark Andrews. He's facing the Atlanta Falcons. No, he's just been bad because of Tyler Huntley. But also I wonder if there's lingering injury issues that he's dealing with. I just wonder about that, if that's being underreported. Nevertheless, against the Atlanta Falcons, was only able to muster 3 for 45 on 5 targets. Andrews is my tight end 13 on the week, which still feels too high. His consensus is tight end 5. There we go. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in. Appreciate y'all. And once again, my name is Bradley. You can follow me on Twitter at FFStalder. Make sure you're getting that Fantasy Data subscription. Use the promo code FFF20. That will give you 20% off any size subscription. Good luck in your fantasy championships. Until next time, good luck in the fantasy football streets, everybody.